I'm bang on time, so I will get going. Well, thank you everybody for coming. My name's Sarah Young, and today I'm going to talk to you about application identities and why they are important, well, why they're important and why we have not been paying enough attention to them from a security perspective. It's quite a big thing. Pretty much what we're going to do today, this is a really cheesy phrase, North Star. I also say, because I'm from Australia, that you can't say North Star because we don't have a North Star in Australia. I say that to my American colleagues because I think I'm funny. But what I'm going to talk about today is just, how we can prevent, or we can't prevent because it's security, and security is not 100%. But we want to try and reduce the likelihood that something bad will happen to an application identity. So before we go any further, though, I'll just tell you about who I am. So I am a senior cloud security advocate at Microsoft. There's only 4 of us in the world. It's a relatively new team. We are part of the wider advocacy DevRel bit of Microsoft, but as the name suggests, I do security. And security is really interesting for advocacy because, if you're a Java advocate or if you're a .NET advocate, you talk to people who do Java or you talk to people who do .NET. Whereas security, I talk to everybody. So it's really interesting. And that's why I try and spend more time, not at security conferences, but at dev conferences and other IT things. I live in Melbourne, in Australia. I have lived in lots of other places, but that's where I live at the moment. I've moved a lot, and I'm not planning on moving anymore because I went and got furry children. So, it's too much hassle now. I have loved talking about securing things before this was my actual job. I used to do it as I call it my hobby of going to conferences. This is my second NDC. It's my first one since COVID. I did, for anybody who may have attended it, anybody go to NDC Gold Coast in 2019? It was a really tiny little NDC in Australia. Nobody? Nobody? Okay. Well, it was a little one, so I'll forgive you. I've also written some. If you are in your field of work, if you happen to need to take Microsoft exams, I have co-written some of those books. I co-write them because it pays for when my dog breaks his teeth and needs dentistry. That's not even a joke. And that's quite serious. I also co-host a security podcast. It's Azure Security. So again, if you don't do stuff on Azure, it might be a little bit niche. And as you can tell, definitely a crazy dog woman. I have put them out. I did this before the start of the talk. I'm always big on bringing the stickers. I mean, there's no Microsoft booth. Otherwise, I probably would have loaded them up there. So when we get to the end of the talk, feel free to come and help yourself to some stickers and ask me questions. Or I know so I hear that Norway is not so big on asking questions, so you can just come and take the stickers as well. But yes, and the good news is as well, normally I don't take a full hour for this talk, so you can also run out and beat the queues for the food as well, because I've been noticing there's it gets really queuey on the breaks, so hooray, but we'll see how we go. So to start with, just want to level set and talk about what I mean by an application identity or workload identity. So we actually have lots of different types of identities, and they're all here. So normally what we think of when we think of an identity is we think of a person. So, like me, Sarah, here. I have an identity. I have a login. It's attached to me, and it has various different attributes and permissions. And we know, even if you're not focused on security in your role, that there are lots of attack vectors around trying to compromise a person's identity. So you might get someone who's trying to get your password, or they might, if you use the same username and password in 2 different places, it gets dumped on the internet in one place, and then people can use it again when they buy that dump off the internet, things like that. And that's true. A lot of identities are people. Of course they are. But we actually have this whole other bit which is machine identities. So machine identities could be a device, it could be IoT, and we have workloads as well. Now, that's what I'm going to be talking about today, these workloads. So things like so when I say workload, we're talking things like service principals, or what was traditionally known a long time ago as service accounts. Who here has seen a service account at some point during their career that was created a very long time ago? Oh, there you go, sir, yes, okay. Was it created a long time ago? Did it have lots of permissions it didn't need? Yes, exactly. And was that because no one really understood how it worked, so it was just easier to give it all the permissions? There you go. Yes. So, we've had these identities around for a really long time, and and people forget they're even there because they're working in the background. It's generally a service talking to another service, and this still exists in cloud today. It's not just an on-prem concept, and attackers, as we know, they get savvy to what we do. So, they're always looking for new attack vectors, and we're seeing a real uptick in this attack on workload things. So, as I said, I tend to get ahead of myself with my slides. I realize I talk, and then I'm like, oh, I should have moved slide. But anyway, so, when we create a service principal, and again, it doesn't matter, by the way, I should have said this as part of my level setting. If you don't use Azure AD, I'm going to show you some demos that are going to show you Azure AD. I mean, I work for Microsoft, that's the stuff I have available to me. But security, it doesn't really matter what vendor you're using here. The principles of what I'm talking about and what you need to secure are exactly the same no matter what identity provider you're using and no matter what cloud provider you're using. This is still a problem. So maybe some of the names I'm using, they'll have a different name if you're using a different product, but I'm going to be honest with you, most of these things are interchangeable. Conceptually, they're the same thing. So just in case you're thinking, oh, have I come to a Microsoft talk? It's not, I promise. This is bigger than that. It's an architectural kind of problem. And as the gentleman here agreed with me, most of these accounts, when they're made, they're over-permissioned. Now, we know that we know the principle of least privilege. I have listened to talks in the last day and a half where we've talked about the principle of least privilege, which is whatever it is, a person, a workload, should not have any more permissions than it is required to do its job. Now, that sounds lovely, but we also know that particularly, I would say, with workloads, permissions can be very granular. They can be pretty difficult. And sometimes you can't be bothered to sit there and actually work out precisely what it needs to work. So you go, screw it, I'll just give it admin. I'll give it everything. Because you need to get things working. And I totally get it. I have done it too. But of course, the more permissions something has, if that identity is compromised, you're making your attacker's life very easy, because if they didn't have privileges and they got into an account, they would at least have to spend some more time trying to escalate the privileges or move around. But if they hit an account that's got privileges straight away, it's pretty much game over. And in fact, I had a conversation with a gentleman at breakfast yesterday in the hotel who was telling me that he suffered a breach and got ransomware, which is, the attack du jour at the moment, alongside crypto mining, and it was because of an over-permissioned account. So it really, really does happen. And so what we end up with is a lot of these identities sitting in your environment. They're doing things in the background. People forget they're there because they're not people, and they're a big attack vector. So, some of the examples, as I was saying, it tends to be service to service. So it could be your service talking to a backup server. If thinking about this from a security lens, does everyone know what ransomware is? I'm going to do this. Anybody not know what ransomware is? Good. Okay, cool. So I won't explain it then. So with ransomware, pretty much, there are lots of other controls, but as your fail-safe for ransomware, you want to have a backup, because if all else fails, at least you have a backup that you can that you are able to restore from. So, backing up is still a thing that we need to do. CRM systems, of course, they talk to lots of other different services. And then we've also got security software. Security software is often monitoring, so it's looking at other services, it's looking at data, so it often needs more permissions as well. And these are the things that will run in the middle of the night, they'll run in the background, and we don't think about them that much. And that's the problem. So the problem is that non-human identity attacks are increasing. They really are. And that's because we know that these businesses and organizations are like laser focused on looking at people, their people identity. So I'm sure whatever organization you're in, you hear, oh, you must use multi-factor authentication. Don't use the same password. Don't share it. You can't share an account. If you have admin privileges, you will have an admin account and you will have your everyday account. These are all good practices, by the way, and if you don't do them, go do them. But I'm sure you all do them. But that's great for people, but how do we apply that to non-human identity things? And the thing is, with a machine identity, all the same kind of things can be done. So you can use a machine identity to get into an environment and put ransomware in. You can use it to exfiltrate data. And then you can be, again, it's generally bad. And we're in, the European Economic Area, so it's even worse here. It can be... of course, you've got a lot of different services often talking across different clouds, or you've got cloud talking to on-prem. And then, of course, we've got APIs. I mean, everyone builds on APIs now. And APIs talking to each other, that's an identity. Interestingly, this is not this part of the world, but towards the end of last year in Australia, one of the biggest telcos, there are like two very big telcos in Australia. One of them had a massive security breach. And if you haven't heard about it, of course, it was big news in Australia. Someone had basically got an API, put it on the internet, and it didn't really do any authentication, but it talked to their entire customer database. So basically, someone came along and just requested that the API regurgitated the entire customer database to them with like all the personal information, passport scans, driving license scans, everything. So as you can imagine, and being one of the biggest telcos in Australia, that was like millions and millions of people affected. And it wasn't good. And they're still suffering the consequences since. So, these identities can do a lot. I mean, that one, that wasn't, I would be reluctant to call that an attack, because if you have an API with zero authentication on it, I mean, it doesn't really take much to pull everything, but, it is still a machine identity not done right, for sure. And I want to talk about this streetlight effect here, because essentially, basically, you've got a man, he's searching under a streetlight, and a police officer comes along, says to him, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "I've lost my keys." And so the police officer says, "I'll help you. I'm going to look for it." And the police officer said to him, "Are you sure you dropped your keys here?" And the guy says, no, I dropped them back in the park." And then the policeman is like, "Well, why are you searching here?" And he's like, "Because this is where the light is and I can see." And it's kind of the same problem, is that we have a cognitive bias, and this is just human nature, to what we can see all the time. And that's why we think about people and identities rather than these machines. So, this is the problem that keeps going on, is that we see people all the time. These service-to-service identities sit in the background, run at night. We don't see them, so we don't think about them as much. And we actually forget they also need securing. And because of that, because we don't see they're there, or we don't think about them, we don't think we need to secure them. Well, we don't think about the security of them. I'm sure many of you have a lot of things running around in your environment, but here's some numbers, because I love numbers. So they're a couple of years old now. I'm trying to get some updated ones, but haven't been able to get any yet. But look, 34% of organizations suffered from security incidents by malicious applications. So again, a workload identity. That's nothing to do with a person. So someone manipulated a workload identity. That's like a third. That's very high. And 26 million user logins have been stolen by malicious applications. That's a lot. I'm not going to read out all of these. I'm sure you can see them, but yeah. And here's a good one, actually. 74% of organizations are unaware of the number of digital keys or certificates they have. Anyone in here reckon that their organization has a good inventory of all their certificates and keys? Anyone? No. Okay. There you go. I mean, 74% is really high. So it's not that we're alone. This is a problem across the board. But it's a big problem. But look, I mean, and we have had stuff in the news as well. So again, some of these are a couple of years old, but Solargate, I'm sure at least some of you in the room remember Solargate. That was a supply chain compromise. And basically, the attacker got into the environment and then started to move around. When they did the post-mortem of this attack, the attackers had got into the system, and then they'd moved around laterally using the application identities that were over-permissioned, because it was far, far easier than trying to use people identities that were better secured. I realize people identities is not a word. You know what I mean. But because there's often a misconception that I talk about a lot, which is attackers, people think a lot of the time that, you know, a hacker is someone who sat there in a hoodie, like going blah, 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 you know, a la Matrix or whatever, you know, like tap, 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 doing something crazy complicated. When in fact, everything shows, all the research from us, from other people, attackers don't go for the super hard hacks. Like, they go for the easy stuff. So if you've done something that's just like not best practice and easy for them to manipulate, hooray. If you've done something like that, and it's going to take them 5 minutes, they're going to go for that over spending a month trying to create a 0 day. And because it doesn't make sense for them, it's not worth their time. So they're always looking for these really, really easy ways to do it. Also, what they do, in Solargate in particular, was they got into these applications that were over-permissioned, and then they use it, because they were legitimate applications in the environment, they basically hid what they were doing within the context of the application, and that's why it wasn't picked up for quite a long time. So, you know, these folks are pretty... like, they know what they're doing. Then there's consent phishing. Now, consent phishing is basically, you'll know, if you go on a website and you, or even like a new application, it says, hey, do you consent to this application doing blah? Does anybody, hands up if you actually read the permissions. 1, 2, okay, maybe about a third, maybe, okay. So, and then hands up if you just go, yes, I want to use the thing. Okay, yes. So I do read permissions now. I'm a security person. Like, I'm always like, no, I have to read it. But, you know, because we're quite used to seeing that consent thing, it's for a lot of us, it's human nature just to click on it and go, yeah. It's like agreeing to terms and conditions, right? You just go, yeah, I just want to use the thing. But attackers have manipulated that behavior to compromise applications, then ask for more permissions than they need, and from that they can launch an attack. So it's really, really, and then they can impersonate you as a user. If you've granted that application more rights to your identity, they can then start to manipulate your account. So it's pretty interesting. And it basically preys on users that have already been logged in. So it's even effective. So it's effective against strong passwords. It's effective against MFA and passwordless setups, biometrics, because you are already logged in. So we've gone past all those controls. So it's a good day for the attackers. And then, I mean, we know this. I'm sure everyone's aware of this as a problem. Anyone had an organization? Anyone accidentally put keys in a public GitHub repository? uploaded them by accident? Oh, congratulations for being honest. Oh, and another one. Thank you. The rest of you, assuming that most of you do development work of some sort, I don't believe that there's not more people in this room, but it's a really easy mistake to make. And if you start getting creds, again, you can start pretending to be people and things. Of course, we're getting much better. There's a lot of tools out there now that can help find this quickly, but because it's such a prolific problem, the research shows that if you even accidentally upload a key to a public repo, there are attackers, multiple attackers, who scan public repos just constantly. They have tools constantly scanning, that now we reckon the time for them to pick up a key, from the time they upload it to the time it starts, if the time you upload it, or I'm going to assume accidentally, to someone finding it and using it is minutes. Like, it's really quick. It's quite scary. Of course, there are a lot of enterprise tools and all the cloud providers also scan and try and pick them up, but that time for people to start using them is really quick now. So what do we do? The main threat here is that if an application identity is compromised, it's a legitimate app that's been hijacked, which I think is probably one of the worst things to deal with, because it is a legitimate thing. It's actually easier to find things that aren't supposed to be in your environment at all than find something that's been hijacked and basically doing the things it should be, but maybe doing some dodgy things as well. We then have malicious applications that have been entirely new. That's a more traditional form of attack. And then you've got misconfigured things as well. So things that have been given too much permission, or they've been given the wrong permissions that then potentially can be manipulated. So here's like the attack graph. Now, in there, I've also got all the T numbers. So for those of you, if you're not familiar with what the T numbers are, they are the MITRE attack framework techniques. So every attack technique has a T number, and this is an industry-wide thing. If you're kind of even semi into security, it's quite interesting to look at. But for a compromised app, this is kind of the flow of what happens. So they'll compromise a cloud admin, then they'll impersonate that, add credentials on top of an existing application. So if the application has access to like just storage, they might start putting in, it starts to have access to other VMs and things like that. Then they impersonate that application and start calling APIs. So that's like one way we can do it. For a malicious app, often what we do is there'll be a phishing email. The user will click on the phishing email. Now, we know phishing emails are getting better. I'm not talking about ChatGPT today, but one of the things, well, I'm talking about it for 10 seconds. But often phishing emails, we find them by the language not being too great. One of the really scary things about ChatGPT is that it writes really lovely prose. And so now attackers that maybe English isn't their first language and it's not very good, they're using ChatGPT to write really amazing phishing emails that you wouldn't be able to pick up are not quite right. So that's a little bit scary. So anyway, phishing email, user clicks on it. It'll say, hey, please consent to blah, 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 blah. People don't read it. They say yes. Then the attacker can take over that user's account, and then it can start calling APIs, or it can start phishing other users. Because if that user doesn't happen to have what they need, that user will then start to phish other accounts until they get what they want. So attackers don't always hit the right mark straight away. Often when, and I know this from my colleagues and other people in the security industry, often when attacks are found, the attackers have been in the environment for a long time. They're not necessarily found straight away. And then for a misconfigured application, they've probably found leaked creds. Does anyone know? Anyone want to guess how much you can buy like a whole dump of creds for online? I mean, oh, go on. $5. $5, little bit more, but very accessible still. About $150. If you want to download like a whole dump of emails and passwords, it's like scarily accessible. I mean, don't go buy dumps, but So, if those creds have been leaked and somebody uses the same username and password combination in multiple places, which we know a lot of people do, they can then use that to start impersonating an application. And these creds as well, these cred dumps can also include applications. I realize I kept saying people there. Then when you get in, you can enumerate that, sort of pull the whole directory in an organization. And then again, you can start finding users calling APIs, doing dodgy things. So, I've already said, particularly for the applications that already exist in your environment, it's quite hard to pick up. But how do we pick up this stuff? So first thing is sign-in logs. Now, sign-in logs, they're getting way better. It's not just a so-and-so logged in here and logged out here. There's a lot more to sign-in logs in any modern identity provider. You can usually get like the IP address, the country, what device or type of device it's logging in from, what resources it's actually trying to access, and you can use that sort of stuff to look for patterns as well. I'm going to talk about it a bit more later. Because literally signing in and signing out doesn't give you a lot of information to go on, whereas if you see a sign in, and it's, for me, I constantly sign in from Australia. If I suddenly start signing in from Norway, that might be suspicious. For me, it's not. But for example, if I have signed in here. If I signed in, I'm here in Norway right now. If the directory service saw me sign in to Australia in the next 10 minutes, for example, that can't be me because I cannot physically get to Australia in 10 minutes. So there are things that this additional information around sign-in logs can really help us understand what may or may not be a legitimate sign-in. And then we also have audit logs as well. Most directory providers will have audit logs as well. So that will be, if suddenly more permissions were being given out. So we would always recommend if suddenly there's a lot of admin privileges being given out to accounts that didn't have them before, that's typically pretty suspicious. So in Azure land, that can be, and also, well, I've put it in Azure, but again, any cloud you're using, if your key storage is getting the permissions changed or more people are being given access to your key store, whatever you're using, again, looks pretty strange. So there's all kinds of things here. Also, sometimes the time things happen. So it might be, I know we're all in tech, so we all work at crazy times and we can all work from home. But, I don't regularly work completely in the middle of the night, Australian time. So if we saw something like that, that's not my normal pattern of behavior. So again, there's a lot of different things here that can identify, that can start to look suspicious. And so that's what we need to look for. Also, we need to worry about leaked creds. So you should be looking, and again, there are multiple tools out there. You should have some kind of tool that is looking for creds that have been leaked, either accidentally or maliciously. So, as I said, accidentally uploading keys to your repo, or it could be username and password combinations. There are ways that we can find at least some of those things, and if we find them, we can do something about them. So nowadays, this is much, much easier because of cloud. Most big vendors will offer a tool that will have a look for secrets that exist in your environment, and they will look to see if they can see anything similar out there on the big wide internet. So again, it's something to have a look at as well. Make sure, if you're in Azure land, Microsoft land, it's called identity protection. But there are plenty of tools out there that have the same capability, and it doesn't matter whether it's Microsoft or not. And then, what do you actually do if this happens? That's pretty important. So the basics of incident response are not dissimilar between standard IT operations and security operations. Stay calm and do no harm. And I have seen this happen. The worst thing you can do is start deleting accounts left, right, and center, or turn off all the VMs, or pull out the internet plug. That's probably going to end you in a worse situation, although it might seem like what you need to do. involve your legal team, because there are usually legal ramifications. I'm not an expert on that, but make sure you've got everybody involved. Obviously, be careful about sharing information publicly. A lot of companies are not great at doing that in the right way, and get help when needed. There are not very many organizations out there that have the size and the scale to have a dedicated incident response team. Very few, because it's a very specialized thing. But there are plenty of consultancies and companies that have incident responders, and their job is actually they're a bit like Avengers Assemble. You basically call the red phone, and they will come in and rescue you, basically. We have a team like that in Microsoft. They're called Microsoft IR, Incident Response. And we always say about them, because they're lovely, but we always say about them, they're the team that you never want to meet. Because if you meet them, you're having a pretty bad day. But they have very specialized knowledge. I am not an incident response expert like they are. And, if you don't have that capability in your organization and you realize you've been compromised, go and get external help, because when it starts to get, it's not just a case of changing passwords. And because I have seen this, they're like, if we just change the passwords, we'll be fine. And attackers like to live off the land. They have a lot of techniques to keep themselves in your environment. And what we see is if people don't have the specialist knowledge to remove people from their environment, what they will do is they will sit in your environment, go really quiet and essentially hide, and then they wait till they think you've forgotten, and then they'll start doing dodgy things again. So you do need people who really know how to get rid of these people when they're in. In terms of containment, same kind of thing as you would do for any kind of incident. You want to contain it as soon as possible. Before you just go and disable something, though, you do need to think about your security and business impact. Because it's all good saying, let's just turn it off. But say you're an e-commerce thing and you just turn off your website, you're going to lose a lot of money. So, it's again, never have a knee-jerk reaction. Make sure you weighed up what you're doing. Also, weigh up the impact of deleting keys or rolling keys. Often, if you do things like that, that can also have a bad day if you're not thinking about it, especially if you've got a lot of keys and identities that you're not really fully mapped out. Also, if you think admin creds have been compromised, because, of course, admin creds have far more permissions. You basically have to do what we call an eviction event. Anyone heard that phrase? Yeah, so it kind of does what it says on the tin. You have to boot the attackers out. This is what I was saying before. It's quite a specialized thing. You probably need, unless you have incident responders, you probably want to get some people in to help you do it, because you have to make sure that they're actually gone, because they're really good at hanging on in there, because once they're in, it's easy for them to stay. Or that's what they want to do. And then, to remediate all these things, you'd need to tidy up your service principals and your machine identities, delete your malicious apps, and, implement identity protection or something along those lines to make sure it doesn't happen again. The sad thing about security is, of course, a lot of businesses get very laser focused on security after that something has happened, as opposed to before, which is, of course, a little bit sad. And then how do we stop it happening, though? Because that's what we want to do. We want to be proactive. It's exactly the same as people, almost. Use strong creds. Accounts should not have any more privilege than they need. You should have a lifecycle management for them. So you shouldn't have, if an application or workload is not used anymore, the identity associated should also be removed. There have been many instances of attacks happening because there have been identity accounts that aren't even used anymore, and they're just still floating in the environment. And if they're still there, there's the potential for them to be compromised. I used to work at a bank years ago, and we used to do identity reviews. Now, this was before we had cloud tools, and the identity review had to be done manually, which, let me tell you, is not very fun. We found somebody who was dead in there. And I'm not kidding. So, they should not have been in there. And there were plenty of people who had left, and all their accounts not all their accounts have been removed. And then you should be monitoring any anomalies. So like I was talking about before, somebody logging in from loads of different countries in a short period of time, that's not normal. People logging in at weird hours or to resources they've never used. This used to be really difficult to do, but nowadays there are a lot of security tools that kind of will pick up on this anomaly if you just let them run and do their thing. So that's what you want. But here's kind of a nice summary of the difference. So see, for users, just to put it on the screen, what is different here, you can see. For users, like I said, you shouldn't have easy passwords. In fact, I like to say you shouldn't have passwords at all now. We should be getting rid of passwords because everyone knows they're rubbish and human brains are rubbish at remembering them. But at least make sure they're strong. Make sure you have multi-factor authentication. You should be using proper certificates and workload identities. I had a conversation only a couple of months ago with a colleague of mine who was like, I'm just going to put this string in Key Vault. And I was like, isn't that for an application? And he's like, yeah, I just put the string in Key Vault. And I was like, please don't just use a string. Like, can we use something a bit better? We have so many better things. Gonna say, for those people who do build things in here, do you use like a managed identity rather than a string? Whatever. One. Please, who uses strings still? Because it's easy. Thank you, sir, for your honesty. I promise, something that is interesting, because I had this discussion, is that it's actually become a lot easier to use managed identities, I promise. Like, I know they used to be a pain. They're actually not as hard. Also, do not have long credential times for expiration. I know, I think in Azure, that you can set your secrets to expire, I think it's like 2,999. I believe you can't get to the year 3000. Again, who does that? I like to use my sessions as like confess your security sins to me. Like, we're all friends here. Who likes to just set them for 1,000 years, or as long as the system will? Yes. Okay, yes. Like, or as long as the system will allow you. Don't do that, please. Please don't do that. Have a short lifespan, and then rotate things, please. Like, something that we are bad at, though, in security, I will say, I know I'm standing here saying, go and do this, and I know it's hard, it can be hard, and in a realistic environment, it's hard, and you may have been burnt by security in the past. I talk to a lot of people outside of security in IT who have historically had some really negative interactions with security, and so they don't want to talk to them. I think that is changing in security, that we do want to actually help. So please, I'll say, give us another chance and come and talk to us, and we can show you. Give us another chance and come and talk to us, because some of the ways that we used to do this, although it might look the same on the surface, it's become much, much easier. And again, I'm not talking about a particular cloud or a particular product. Across the board, everything has become much easier. So give us a chance to show you. Again, least privilege. I mean, look, everyone knows least privilege. You shouldn't have permissions that you don't need. It's a highway to having a really bad day, and you're just making attackers' lives easier. I have a sticker down here, which you're welcome to come and get at the end, that says, because you've got to remember, attackers will just go through whatever they can. It says, that's out of scope, said no attacker ever, because attackers just go through everything. So, make it hard. Make it as hard as you can for them. And then, of course, lifecycle management, tidy up your identities if you can. If you've got stale apps, stale creds, if you've got some test stuff, some sandbox stuff that you then deleted, make sure the identity's gone too. Of course, monitor things, at least monitor things that have high permissions, the things that could do the most damage. Of course, I get that I'm telling you to do lots and lots of different things. But for those of you who are developers, this is probably a lot of stuff that your security team should be helping you with, and it's probably ultimately more their responsibility. But please go tell them, go challenge them and say, hey, are you doing this? Where should I put my creds? How can I do this? And I know it's not your number one priority, I know, but this stuff comes back round to all of us, and we're supposed to be working closer together. And I blame security mostly, by the way, for that not being a thing. So, and then anomalies. I already talked about it. You know, anomaly, if an account, people, or machine is doing something it shouldn't, this is bad. So I'm going to show you just a click through. Obviously, I'm going to show you this in Azure, but again, principally, what I'm showing you is the same everywhere. So I'm just having a look at my time. Okay, cool. So what you can see here is we have, we're going to create a new policy in conditional access. I'll talk about what conditional access is in a second if you are not familiar. So I'm going to find some users or workload identities to apply my policy to. So you can see I'm going to select workload identities because that's what we're talking about. So here you can see I've got all these workload identities for all my different apps. So I'm going to pick Woodgrove PeopleSoft there, and I'm going to start to apply this policy. So then we can say, do we want to have a cloud app? Do we want to have an application, or do we want to have actions? Now, I'm just going to click all the cloud apps because I want this policy across everything. And then we're going to start to pick conditions, and these are the conditions for conditional access. Now, what we're going to have here is we're going to talk about configuring it based on physical location, and then we've got some other things we can include. I won't go into this too much, but real quick, because we have trusted locations and blah, blah, and this is going into more identity than I want to in this talk, but we're also going to then say, based on these conditions, what risk. The slide I thought was coming up earlier isn't coming up yet. So I'm going to just keep going for a sec. Where is it? Aha. So put it in the wrong place. So I wanted to talk about what conditional access is. Now, again, this is what we call it in Microsoft land. If you're using another identity source, you will have something similar, but it probably has a different name. So essentially what this is so everyone remember account password lockouts? Like you did it wrong 5 times and you got locked out and you had to call the help desk? Yeah. Yes, there, one hand up. I know you all did it. So conditional access is like the modern version of that, lockouts, but much, much better and less painful. So when you log in, even if you log in incorrectly, or, even if you log in correctly and you don't get the wrong password, we look at all the different conditions of your login. So by that we mean where were you? What machine are you logging in off? What time is it? What are you actually trying to access? And we can do that from literally whatever you log in with. Absolutely anything. Phone, tablet, laptop, whatever it is, we can see all of that, and it's the same for machine identities. And then what we do is, based on the normal patterns that have come from that identity, we will have a look and then say, hey, what is this? High, medium, low risk. So we do that. So if it looks like every other login you do, it's probably going to be low risk. If it's completely different, it might be high risk. And then what you can do, you can configure, which is what I'm just showing you, is we can configure what happens based on what the risk likelihood is. And again, this is a very security phrase, so I apologize. The reason that the product lets you do that is so you can pick what works for your organization. Because you can see there, the top one is block. So you could say, if this is a high-risk login, block them. But if you do that, then and you get people who maybe travel a lot or maybe have unusual login patterns, every time you block them, they're going to have to call the help desk and get themselves unblocked. So you might just want to limit their access, or just say, hey, you need to redo your MFA, so we're pretty sure you are who you say you are. So I travel a lot for work. Well, I had a bit of a gap during COVID, but I travel quite a lot for work. And when and so me moving countries quite a lot is not unusual, but one day I went on holiday, so it wasn't actually a work trip, to Nepal. Now, I don't know what specifically Azure AD wasn't very happy about with Nepal, so I'm sorry, Nepal, if there's anyone from Nepal in here. I don't know what it was, but it decided that it wasn't sure that was part of my usual pattern. And so I was asked to re-authenticate myself. And I've only ever been asked to do it once, like that one time in Nepal. But you can see there's quite a few different different things you can pick there. So you pick whatever makes sense for your company. And again, it's probably something your security people should be telling you. And you probably wouldn't configure this. But again, I think it's really important that even if this isn't something you would configure as a dev, it's really good to like understand what we're trying to do, and that it's not just as straightforward, and we're not just doing, if you get your password wrong 5 times, we'll lock you. Like, it's much smarter than that nowadays. Anyway, going back, because I thought that slide was a little bit closer. So basically here, what we're doing is we're going to say we're actually configuring those risk settings, and we're actually saying here, hey, if it's high risk, we're just going to block you. Now, I don't love blocking, because blocking makes people angry, especially if it's wrong. And let's be honest, it tends to be, everyone knows that Murphy's Law says that blocking happens to senior people who get really upset. Yeah, but you know what? Also, attackers do purposely target senior people, not because they have loads of permissions, though often they do because they just demand them. But yes, knowing laugh, somebody knows what I'm talking about. But yeah, but then what we can do, again, I'll go past this, is, and again, like I said, I'm showing you the Azure version, but you know, all your identity providers will have similar. We can actually have a look at the conditional access reporting. So we can see here, you know, what kind of device is logged in. We can see what device it came from, what application it was accessing, where it came from. We can actually map it. Again, we can see where people are. My travel map at the moment would be fairly funky, but let's face it, for the last 3 years during COVID, it was quite firmly stuck in one place. So again, different times, depending on what's happening in the world. And then we also, in Azure AD, how we do it is we actually have, we actually will list risky workload identities. So if we flagged it as looking weird, you can actually have a look at all of them and review them. Again, probably a security operations team job, but like I said, I think it's important to know how this stuff works and what you could do, even if you're not doing it. And then, of course, we can do things like we can re-enable the service principal if it's risky and we've blocked it. We can dismiss it. Again, this is just the actions that can be taken for this. And then, of course, we can have a look at the detections. So detections are different. This is when, rather than it being risky, what we've got here is that what it's actually saying is we can see that we've seen leaked creds. So the Microsoft tool, identity protection, if it's seen the creds that are in Azure AD are actually floating around somewhere on the internet, and we have a lot of scanning and stuff that looks for this stuff, it will highlight here so you can go in and change the key, change the secret, whatever it is, before someone else dumps it off the internet and does something bad with it. So yeah, that, and then you can see here, it said, and then we've got risky things. So you can see here, unusual addition of creds to an OAuth app. It might be legit, it might not be. That's why we call it a risk, but it's probably something that someone wants to look at, especially if that same identity has got other multiple things going on that look suspicious. So yeah, as you can see here, here's a good one. This is, we actually put, just for this demo, we actually put a secret in GitHub to make it trigger. So it really does work. You don't need to go and try it unless you want to. Don't make it a real key though, you know, bad things. Anyway, a little bit Microsoft specific, but go and try out your identity protection features. Again, whatever they're called, if you're not using Azure AD, I don't mind. Go use Okta, go use whatever, and go and look at this identity stuff. If you are building apps and you are not using a proper if you're not using a proper workload identity that comes into a directory service, and you're just using a string, go and rethink that, please. It's not a good idea. We do have on there some like Azure AD best practices. Make sure your applications have owners as well, something specific. And we've also got some incident response playbooks, like if you do break things or things go wrong. Thank you very much. I told you, what time is it? I told you I wouldn't get to a full hour because I talk pretty quick. That QR code is a link to a lot of interesting articles and other things. If you find this stuff interesting that you can read up on, I'm experimenting. Usually I do the slide, take a picture, but I'm experimenting with QR code this time. I'm also talking tomorrow about architecting a secure cloud framework, if that's something that you find interesting and you want some more security goodness. And yeah, also, if there's any MVPs in the house, hello, MVPs. There seem to be loads of MVPs at this event, and if you want to become an MVP, come talk to me, because we want more security MVPs. I'm biased, I want security MVPs. But if you do work on Microsoft-y stuff and you find it interesting, come chat. And yeah, did anybody have any questions? I've got to do this. Hello.
You talked about sort of identity detection and the conditions that would take to detecting if the user is compromised. Mm-hmm. Is there any impacts or implications of privacy of that user with detection of behavior patterns?
That's a really good question. So for anyone who didn't hear that, if we were looking at an identity being compromised, a user, are there any privacy implications to that? Now, that is actually a really interesting question because it depends who you ask. And I'll tell you what camp I'm in. There isn't a standard industry response for this in terms of security. So it depends what you define as PII. So some people say that looking at a user's login and what they do on a system is PII. I don't think it is, and I'll tell you why. So obviously, there's a name attached to someone's identity. But like I said, there is no, I think, solid agreement on this, so you can feel free to disagree with me. But all a user identity is in an environment is a person. It's got a name attached to it, of course. But in terms of security monitoring, all we're looking at is what when that person logs in, where they log in from, the device, and what they're accessing. That is not really personally identifiable information, and it's not, in my opinion, and that's because there's nothing you can really do with it. And when you sign up for a company or when you sign up for a service, you agree to terms and conditions that generally say, you're going to use this service and we're going to basically have a look at what you're doing. Certainly if there could be PII implications, personal information implications, if your logs have a lot of other information about a user in. Now, if your the logs that you're collecting for security monitoring have a lot of things like address, age, date of birth, you need to rethink your logs because they shouldn't have that for security monitoring. And actually, I have come across that before. I'm of the opinion that you shouldn't, if your logs have got a load of PII, like date of birth, address, age, blah, 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 and a name that can be all put together, then you've got a problem with your logs, because those sort of very personal bits that are definitely PII aren't required for security monitoring. But I think the thing is, essentially, if you use a system, whoever's it is, you're sort of accepting that, it's possible to monitor your logging in and out. But as I said, there's not a 100% consensus on that in industry yet. We'll probably get there, but... Any other questions? Hello?
Yeah, so my question is, we discussed about this certain service accounts having higher privileges than desired.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, what would be your advice to basically prevent this? We use Azure and we encountered this quite a few times.
Yeah. Oh, so the question for those who can't hear it was the overprivileged service accounts, workloads, identities. Let me check I got your question right. It's how do you detect they're overprivileged? How can you prevent it from happening? Yeah, because it's not a technical problem. It's a people problem, and as many things in security are. I always say that the people side of security is way more difficult than the tech, because essentially the only way you can not have that over permissioning is by, when things are set up, that people spend the time to work out what permissions something needs and give it the appropriate permissions, rather than saying, oh, whatever, I'll just give it admin. I can't be bothered to sit here and work out what things need. And I realize that that will often take more time, but I think that's more of a training and making people understand when they're provisioning these things, why it's important to make sure the permissions are exactly what they need and no more. Rather than there being anything, rather than it being like a technical problem, it's more of a people and process and understanding type problem. Hello.
Just following up on that.
Yeah.
Is there any ways to identify unused credentials on a workload identity, for instance?
So,
unused permission, I mean.
Unused permission. There is. Well, I can tell you in Azure there is, because you're right. So the question was, for anyone who didn't hear, is there a way to identify permissions that aren't being used? So I can tell you in Azure AD there is, and I would assume that there probably is in most other identity products. You can do something called an access review, and this is something I used to do manually, and I realize it's literally the most painful thing ever. But it's essentially... you can configure something called an access review. And essentially, you can say, hey, give me a list. Hey, Azure AD, give me a list of everything that has permissions that haven't been used in the last month, 3 months, 6 months, whatever you want. And it will list them for you, so then you can actually work through them. So way better than it used to be that you had to like print them off and do it manually. So in fact, that remediation piece has got way, way nicer as well. So yes, you can do something about it that's not too painful. Any other questions? Awesome. Hey, I actually pretty much used the whole time after I said I wouldn't. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I very much appreciate your attention, especially as we're getting towards the end of the day when people get sleepy. I'll stay here. Please come help yourselves to stickers. And if you just want to ask me any questions one-on-one, I'll stay here for a little bit so you can do that. And have a great rest of the conference. And yeah, if you like talking about security, come see me tomorrow as well. So thank you very much.